It was a quiet afternoon at the local grocery store, the kind of day when the aisles were barely populated and the hum of fluorescent lights seemed louder than usual. The shelves were neatly stocked, and the soft chatter of the few customers gave the store a peaceful, almost calming atmosphere. In one aisle near the back, an elderly man shuffled slowly between the rows of canned goods. His stooped shoulders and frail movements spoke of years that had passed far too quickly. His cane tapped softly on the linoleum floor with each step, a rhythm that seemed in sync with the weight of the years carried in his bones. A simple jacket, worn at the cuffs and faded around the edges, hung loosely over his slight frame. On the front, near the left pocket, a small military insignia was almost invisible, its colors dulled from countless washes over the years. To the other shoppers, he was just another old man, but there was so much more to him than what met the eye. Not far behind, a younger man stood, eyeing the shelves with a mixture of impatience and frustration. He was in his 30s, dressed in a sharp, modern outfit that screamed of the hustle and bustle he thrived on. He moved with an energy that spoke of a world constantly demanding efficiency and speed. Everything about him was rushed, the way he grabbed items from the shelves, the way he checked his watch, even the way his eyes flicked over to the elderly man ahead of him. At first, it was just a glance, a brief moment of noticing the older man's slow progress. But as the seconds ticked by, that glance turned into a silent judgment. The elderly man, still making his way down the aisle, moved with purpose, though it was clear the simple act of walking was an effort for him. But to the younger man, it was simply too slow. With a sigh of frustration, he muttered under his breath, barely loud enough to be heard, "A real has-been, taking forever." He tried to move past the old man, but the veteran's slow, careful movements seemed to block his path. Each step the elderly man took seemed to ignite more irritation in the younger man, who couldn't fathom why someone would take so long to grab a few cans. The tension in the air was thickening, though no one seemed to acknowledge it yet. The younger man's patience had worn thin. Every step the elderly man took, every pause he made to carefully reach for an item on the shelf, seemed to stretch the limits of his tolerance. His grip on the shopping cart tightened, his foot tapping restlessly against the floor. It was as though the world had slowed down to a crawl, and this old man was at the center of it all, causing the delay. Finally, unable to hold back, the younger man couldn't take it any longer. He stepped up behind the veteran, his voice sharp, cutting through the silence of the aisle. "Come on, old man, move it," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "People like you are why everything takes so long. Just hurry up already." The words hung in the air, harsh and biting. The veteran, still with his back slightly hunched, didn't respond at first. He had heard worse in his lifetime, far worse than the callous words of an impatient shopper. He didn't want to engage, not in a public space, and not with someone who clearly had no understanding of what he had endured. But the younger man wasn't finished. He stepped closer, the irritation in his voice now unmistakable. "Seriously, what's your problem? You've got all the time in the world, don't you? People like you think the world owes them something. You should be at home, not holding up everyone else here." The veteran's hands tightened on his cane, his knuckles whitening. He remained silent, his gaze focused on the shelves ahead of him. His face was stoic, but beneath the surface, a quiet pain began to stir. He had heard similar words before, from people who had no idea the price of freedom, the weight of duty, the toll of service. He had seen his friends fall in battles no one remembered, their names erased from history, as if their sacrifice had never meant anything. "Did you even do anything for this country, huh?" The younger man's words grew more pointed, his voice rising. "I bet you didn't even contribute anything. You were just some guy in a uniform." The insult landed like a slap in the face. For a moment, the old man's breath caught in his throat, his hands trembling. He wanted to say something, to respond, to teach this young man about the cost of freedom and the weight of what he carried. But something inside him told him it wouldn't make a difference. The younger man's ignorance was loud and clear, and no amount of words could fill the gap of understanding that had been lost. A few nearby customers had begun to notice the exchange, glancing awkwardly between the veteran and the young man. Some shook their heads, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Others stared, their expressions a mix of confusion and discomfort, unsure of what was happening or how to help. Yet no one stepped forward to diffuse the tension. The veteran's eyes, though, betrayed a quiet sorrow. It wasn't just the insult that hurt. It was the realization that this younger generation had forgotten, or perhaps never learned, what the price of freedom truly was. His pain wasn't just about the words, it was the weight of history, of a lifetime of experiences that couldn't be put into words. This young man didn't understand, and there was nothing he could say to make him understand. The silence between them seemed to stretch longer than it should have, as if the very air was thick with unspoken truths, a history that the young man had dismissed without a second thought. Just as the younger man opened his mouth to spit out another insult, a voice, steady and commanding, interrupted the tension. "You don't know what you're talking about, son," the woman said. Her tone was calm but firm, carrying an authority that stopped the young man mid-sentence. He turned toward her, momentarily startled. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, with silver streaks in her dark hair and the wrinkles of time etched on her face. She wasn't particularly tall, but there was something about her presence, something unspoken, that commanded attention. The younger man, still full of his own frustration, barely acknowledged her, a scoffing smile crossing his face as he muttered, "What's it to you, lady?" But she wasn't deterred. "You've got no idea what that man has been through. You don't have the slightest clue what he's seen or what he's sacrificed. So don't you dare stand there and judge him like that." The young man blinked in surprise, not accustomed to being confronted. "What's the old man gonna do? Talk about the good old days or something?" The woman's eyes narrowed, her gaze unyielding. "You think this is some kind of joke?" She glanced at the veteran for a moment, her expression softening, before turning her attention back to the younger man. "That man standing there is not just any has-been. He served in a war that most people these days have forgotten. He did things that no one should have to do. He faced horrors you can't even imagine." The young man snorted dismissively, but the woman continued, her voice now filled with quiet intensity. "He was their son, in a time when young men like him went off to fight for a cause bigger than themselves. For the freedom you take for granted every single day." She glanced at the veteran, then back at the younger man, her voice lowering as she spoke. "He was in that war. The one that shaped the world you live in today. And it's only because of men like him that you get to sit here and complain about a shopping trip." The younger man stood there, mouth open, not knowing how to respond. The woman wasn't done. She looked over at the veteran, nodding for him to speak. With a slow, deliberate motion, the elderly man finally lifted his head, his weathered eyes meeting the young man's. The veteran's voice carried the weight of years spent holding memories that no one wanted to remember. "I was there," he began, his words measured. "I fought in places you'll never hear about in the history books. Places where men like me were sent to die. And many of them did. They died for what they believed in: freedom, country, family." The young man, still standing there, now unsure of himself, felt his arrogance begin to waver. He didn't speak, but his eyes stayed fixed on the elderly man, as if waiting for more. "I saw things," the veteran continued, his voice distant, as though recalling something painful. "Things that no one should ever see. I've held my friends in my arms as they took their last breaths, knowing I couldn't do a damn thing to save them. We went in on missions, and sometimes we didn't come back." His words paused, and for a brief moment it seemed as if the weight of his memories threatened to swallow him whole. "I lost more than I can count. I was one of the lucky ones to make it out, but not without a price." The younger man's face shifted, his earlier anger replaced with something else: uncertainty, guilt, maybe even shame. Around them, the few bystanders who had been glancing nervously began to gather, some leaning in, others visibly moved by the weight of the veteran's words. The veteran, despite the emotion that clearly threatened to overwhelm him, continued in his calm, unwavering tone. "I came back, but I came back different. We all did. We didn't talk about it. We couldn't. Who would understand? But we didn't fight for ourselves. We fought for everyone else, even if they didn't know it." The young man's chest tightened as he listened, his mind struggling to keep up with the heavy reality that was unfolding before him. The veteran paused again, taking a deep breath. I was part of a mission, a dangerous one, a mission I never should have come back from. My friends, they died. All of them. He looked down briefly, then met the younger man's eyes. But they died for something bigger than themselves. And you think I'm a has-been? The words hit the younger man harder than any insult. His face paled, and he shifted uncomfortably. For the first time he had no response, nothing snarky to say, no insult to throw. What could he possibly say to a man who had lived through horrors he could never imagine? The surrounding customers stood in silence, some with tears in their eyes, others simply lost in thought. The young man shifted on his feet, unable to meet the veteran's gaze. His mind raced, his earlier frustrations now replaced with a deep sense of regret. The veteran, with a quiet nod, turned and began to slowly walk away, his cane tapping once more as he moved toward the checkout. The young man stood frozen, his earlier arrogance gone, replaced with a haunting awareness of just how little he had truly known. The young man stood there for a long moment, his body still, his eyes following the elderly veteran as he slowly made his way toward the checkout. His heart felt heavy, weighed down by the realization that he had just witnessed something life-changing. And yet, the knowledge of his earlier actions left him feeling exposed, vulnerable. Gone was the cocky, impatient attitude that had defined him just moments before. In its place was a deep sense of guilt and humility. He wanted to say something, to apologize, but words felt so small, so insignificant now. How could anything he said undo the harm he'd caused? How could he take back the careless insults and disrespect he'd thrown at the man who had given so much? Behind him, the older woman who had stepped in earlier watched him with a knowing gaze. She had seen this before. The awakening, the shift that came when someone truly understood the weight of another's life. She took a step closer, her voice quiet but firm. "You know," she began, "it's easy to forget, isn't it? To forget those who came before, those who fought to give us everything we have. It's easy to take freedom for granted when it's all we've known." The young man's eyes flickered toward her, his throat tight. He hadn't expected this, but her words resonated deeply, their meaning sinking in with every passing second. "The thing is," she continued, "people like him, veterans, they don't ask for recognition, they don't ask for gratitude, but we owe them more than we can ever repay. Because of them, we're able to walk around here, to live our lives, to complain about the little things." She paused, her eyes softening as she looked at the young man. "We forget that our freedoms, our ability to have a voice, to make choices, come at a great cost." The young man stood silent, his head lowered. He felt the weight of her words settle deep within him, a truth he couldn't ignore anymore. For the first time in a long while, he felt small, not in a way that crushed his spirit, but in a way that made him see the world more clearly. He had been blind to the bigger picture. He had been so consumed by his own impatience, his own frustrations, that he had failed to recognize the sacrifices that had shaped the life he took for granted. Slowly, he turned and started walking toward the checkout, his steps uncertain, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. When he reached the veteran, he hesitated for a moment, his mouth dry. But then he found his voice, quieter now, softer. I'm sorry," he said, his words laced with sincerity. I didn't know. I was blind to what you've been through, to what you've sacrificed. I was wrong." The elderly man, who had been slowly placing his items on the conveyor belt, looked up at him. There was no anger in his eyes, no judgment, just a quiet understanding. A small, weary smile curled at the corners of his lips. "Don't worry about it, son," the veteran replied, his voice gentle, yet firm. "It's not easy to understand, not unless you've walked in our shoes, but you're young. You've got time to learn." His eyes softened further as he gave a slow nod. "Just remember that the things we fought for weren't for us. They were for you, for all of you." The young man stood there for a moment, the weight of those words settling in his chest. It wasn't about making up for past mistakes. It was about understanding that sometimes the lessons that matter most don't come with immediate answers. They come with reflection, with humility, and with the quiet recognition that some sacrifices are bigger than we can ever imagine. As the elderly man paid for his groceries and slowly walked out of the store, the young man stood still for a few moments longer. The store, once just an ordinary place where people went about their daily routines, now felt different, charged with the weight of history, with the echoes of things that mattered far more than a simple shopping trip. The young man's mind buzzed with thoughts, his heart racing with newfound respect. He couldn't undo the past, but he could choose to be different going forward. He could choose to learn, to listen, and to recognize the sacrifices of those who had come before him. And for the first time, he understood that the most important lessons in life were often the ones learned too late. Lessons that changed everything, even in the simplest of places. As the young man left the store that day, his steps were heavier, his heart quieter, and his perspective forever changed. He had learned a hard lesson about respect. Respect for the men and women who fought for the freedoms we often take for granted. But the lesson went deeper than that. Veterans like the elderly man were not just figures in history books. They were real people, carrying with them stories of sacrifice, pain, and resilience that many of us fail to recognize. History isn't just something we read. It's lived by those who walk beside us, often in silence. It's in the quiet struggles of those who have seen the worst and still carry on, quietly fading into the background as the world moves forward. But we must learn to listen, to honor their stories before it's too late. For in their experiences lies a wisdom that can shape the future, if only we take the time to hear it. If this story resonated with you, remember, respect, understanding, and learning from those who came before us are powerful lessons we can all carry forward. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who might need to hear these words today. And if you want to see more stories like this, subscribe to our channel for more meaningful content. Let's continue to grow together by sharing stories that matter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.